There is a canyon in the American Southwest so vast, so deep that when you stand at its rim for the first time, your brain refuses to process what it's seeing. The Grand Canyon. A mile deep, 277 miles long, and at its bottom a river older than human memory cutting through rock that was formed nearly 2 billion years ago. We've been told the canyon is a triumph of geology, a textbook example of erosion, wind, water, time. That's the official version. But in 1894, something was documented in the American Southwest that doesn't appear in any geology textbook. And it came not from a scientist, not from an explorer, not from the United States government. It came from the Hopi, the oldest continuously inhabited civilization in North America, a people who had lived beside that canyon for longer than written history, a people who for centuries had been trying to warn anyone who would listen about what they said was sleeping beneath it. This is what they said. And this is what was found. To understand what the Hopi were describing in 1894, you first have to understand who the Hopi are. The outside world has spent over a century getting this wrong, and that misunderstanding is the precise reason what they said has been dismissed for so long. The Hopi are not a mythological people. They are not a tribe defined by legends. They are a civilization with one of the most precisely documented oral histories on the planet, a history that researchers have been able to cross-reference with archaeological evidence, geological records, and astronomical data, and found to be strikingly, almost uncomfortably accurate. Their villages on the high mesas of northeastern Arizona, specifically the villages of Old Arabi, have been continuously inhabited since approximately 1100 AD, making them among the oldest continuously occupied settlements in the United States. But the Hopi themselves will tell you their history didn't begin there. It began somewhere else, somewhere deeper. The Hopi describe a cosmology organized around what they call the four worlds, not four eras of mythology, four literal states of existence, each ending in catastrophe and transformation, each leading to the world that came after. The first world they call Tokpela, endless space. The second world, Tokpa, dark midnight. The third world, Kuskurza. And the fourth world, the one we currently inhabit, Tuwakachi, world complete. What matters is not the metaphysics of these worlds. What matters is what the Hopi say happened between them, and specifically where the survivors of each destruction went. They went underground, not metaphorically, not symbolically. They went into the earth and they lived there, and they came back out when the surface world was safe again. The Hopi have specific names for the beings who helped them do this. They call them the Ant People, and they describe these Ant People as taking the Hopi's ancestors beneath the ground, feeding them, sheltering them, and keeping them alive through periods of catastrophic destruction on the surface. Now, mainstream anthropology files this under mythology and moves on. But in 1894, a man named John Wesley Powell decided to look more carefully, and what he found changed the question entirely. John Wesley Powell is one of the most interesting figures in American scientific history, and also one of the most overlooked. He lost his right arm at the Battle of Shiloh during the Civil War, and went on to become the director of the United States Geological Survey and the director of the Bureau of American Ethnology. He was, in other words, the man the United States government trusted to document both the geology and the anthropology of the American West. In 1869, Powell became the first person to run the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon by boat. A terrifying journey through unmapped rapids, through walls of ancient stone, through a geography that no white American had ever seen before. He came back changed, and he came back with questions, because during his time on the river he encountered something the official reports didn't emphasize. The canyon walls in places showed evidence of habitation that was not recent. Handholds carved into sheer rock faces, pathways descending into the inner gorge that seemed designed, not natural. Chambers in the canyon walls whose entrances were carefully constructed, not worn. Powell couldn't explain it, but the Hopi could. When Powell began formally interviewing Hopi elders in the years that followed, he documented something that the ethnological community of his era found fascinating, but ultimately filed away as cultural material rather than scientific evidence. The elders told him that beneath the Grand Canyon there existed a vast system of chambers, tunnels, and passages. They said this system had been there since before human memory. They said it had been inhabited. They said things still lived there, and they said there were entrances that only certain people knew how to find. When Powell asked how far below the surface this system extended, the elders gave an answer that he included. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. In his official notes, they told him it went all the way to the center. In 1909, 15 years after Powell's interviews, the Arizona Gazette published a story that has since become one of the most contested documents in alternative history. The article, published on April 5th, 1909, describes the discovery of a vast underground citadel inside the Grand Canyon by a team of Smithsonian Institution explorers, led by a man named Professor S.A. Jordan. According to the article, Jordan and his team had discovered a series of tunnels carved into the canyon walls at an elevation that placed them hundreds of feet above the current river level, accessible only by rope. Inside these tunnels, they found a network of chambers extending over a mile into the rock. They found mummified human remains. They found stone tablets covered in hieroglyphic-style writing that bore no resemblance to any known Native American script. They found copper and gold artifacts of an unusual design, and they found something the article described only obliquely, something stored deep in the innermost chambers, something Jordan's team chose not to fully describe in the public report. The Smithsonian Institution has, in every era since that article was published, denied any knowledge of this expedition. They say Professor Jordan did not exist. They say no such discovery was made. They say the Arizona Gazette article was either a hoax or a fabrication. And here is where the story gets genuinely strange. The Smithsonian's archives from 1909 are not complete. Specifically, the records from the Bureau of American Ethnology for the years 1908 through 1912 contain gaps that archivists have noted but cannot explain. Not all the records are missing, just certain categories. Records pertaining to field expeditions in the American Southwest. When asked about these gaps, Smithsonian archivists have offered various explanations: fire, flood, routine document disposal. What they have not offered is a complete accounting of where those specific records went. But the Arizona Gazette article didn't exist in a vacuum. And when you trace it back to what the Hopi were saying 15 years before it was published, a different picture begins to emerge. The Hopi word for the place beneath the canyon is Sipapu, or more precisely, Sipapuni. It is the place of emergence, the place where, according to Hopi teaching, the people came up from the underworld into this, the fourth world. The Hopi don't describe Sipapuni as a GPS coordinate. They describe it as the aperture through which the transition happened at the point of contact between worlds. But they also describe it as a real place. A place with a physical entrance. A place that exists in the canyon. In Hopi ceremonial life, smaller symbolic Sipapus appear in kivas, the underground ceremonial chambers central to Hopi ritual practice. In every kiva, there is a small hole in the floor. This hole represents the original Sipapu, the door between worlds, the passage through which the ancestors came. The fact that the Hopi conduct their most sacred ceremonies underground in chambers that replicate the structure of the original underworld is not incidental. It is the architecture of memory. They built the kiva to remember what they came from, and what they say they came from is vast. The Hopi described the underworld not as a single chamber, but as a network, multiple levels, multiple passages, multiple kinds of inhabitants. Some of those inhabitants were people, some were not. The ant people are described consistently across multiple generations of Hopi oral tradition. They are described as small, as having large eyes capable of seeing in the dark, as skilled in the cultivation of food underground, in chambers lit by something other than sunlight. They are described as patient, as ancient, as having been underground for a very long time before the Hopi ancestors ever descended to join them. When the Hopi say the ant people were sleeping beneath the Grand Canyon in 1894, they were not speaking poetically. They were giving a status report. Something was down there, something that had been down there for a very long time, something that was not yet gone. To take the Hopi seriously on this point, you have to confront what we actually know about what's beneath the Grand Canyon. The canyon is one of the most studied geological features on Earth. We know the age of its rock layers with extraordinary precision. We know the chemistry of its mineral deposits. We know the history of the Colorado River that carved it. What we know significantly less about is what's inside the rock. The Kaibab Plateau, the elevated landmass from which the canyon was carved, sits atop one of the most complex karst systems in North America. Karst is a landscape formed by the dissolution of soluble rocks, primarily limestone, creating sinkholes, cave systems, springs, and underground drainage networks. The Kaibab Plateau's limestone layers are riddled with these formations, but accessing them is another matter. The canyon walls are nearly vertical. The inner gorge is accessible only at certain points, and much of the subsurface geology of the Grand Canyon region has simply never been mapped with the kind of precision that would reveal the full extent of what's beneath it. In 2007, a team from the Cave Research Foundation completed a mapping project of Marble Canyon's cave systems that returned results the team described as unexpected. The extent of the connected passages was larger than their models had predicted. The depth of certain chambers exceeded what the surface geology suggested should be possible, and in several locations the cave wall showed evidence of formations that would have taken not thousands but hundreds of thousands of years to develop. The official summary of this research was published in a small circulation geological journal. It received almost no mainstream coverage. Let's go back to 1894 specifically, because the year is not arbitrary in this story. In 1894, the United States was in the middle of a reckoning with the native populations of the Southwest. The reservation system was being consolidated, and simultaneously, a generation of American anthropologists and ethnologists were racing to document what they feared was a dying culture before it disappeared entirely. This urgency produced some of the most detailed ethnographic documentation in American history. Men like Washington Matthews, Frank Hamilton Cushing, Jesse Walter Fewkes, and Alexander Stephen spent years living among the Hopi, learning languages, attending ceremonies, and recording what they heard. What they heard, consistently from elder after elder, was a version of the same story. There were things beneath the ground. The ancestors had known them. Some of those things were still there. Jesse Walter Fewkes is particularly important here. Fewkes was a Harvard-educated zoologist who pivoted to anthropology and eventually became the head of the Bureau of American Ethnology's Archaeology Division. He spent the 1890s extensively documenting Hopi ceremonial life, and his notebooks from this period are held in the Smithsonian's National Anthropological Archives. In his 1894 field notes, Fewkes documented a set of conversations with Hopi elders that were not included in his published papers. These notes were discovered by researcher Gary David in the early 2000s and have since been cited in several alternative history works. In these notes, Fuchs records an elder's description of the chamber beneath the canyon in terms that are unusually specific. The elder described the direction of entry, the method of descent, the nature of the first chambers encountered, and then said something that Fuchs noted but did not publish, something he marked with a question mark and the word anomalous. The elder said the chambers became larger as you went deeper, not smaller, larger, and that at a certain depth the stone gave way to something that was not stone. Fuchs did not elaborate on this in his published work, but he didn't destroy the notes either. He filed them, and they were sitting in the Smithsonian's archives when Gary David found them more than 100 years later. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then come back. There is a geological phenomenon relevant here that rarely appears in popular discussions of the Grand Canyon. It is called the Great Unconformity. The Great Unconformity is a boundary visible in the canyon walls where two rock layers meet that should not logically be adjacent. On one side of this boundary is rock approximately 250 million years old. On the other side, directly beneath it, is rock approximately 1.7 billion years old. Between those two dates, there is a gap of roughly 1.2 billion years of missing geological record. The conventional explanation is a combination of erosion and non-deposition, long periods when the region was above sea level and rock was being worn away rather than built up. This explanation is reasonable and probably partially correct. But the Great Unconformity is not unique to the Grand Canyon. It appears on multiple continents in multiple locations, always representing approximately the same missing time period. The same 1.2 billion year gap shows up in the Canadian Shield, in the Scottish Highlands, in parts of Australia. Whatever caused the Great Unconformity appears to have been global, and it appears to have happened all at once, in geological time. Something happened approximately 550 million years ago that created a boundary between two radically different eras of Earth's history, and that boundary is visible at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. The Hopi description of the transition between the Third World and the Fourth World places the catastrophe that preceded their current existence at the boundary of what we would recognize as the Cambrian period, the precise era that the Great Unconformity borders. This is either a remarkable coincidence or it isn't. The Hopi have no way of knowing the geological age of the rock layers at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and yet the time period they describe as the edge of the previous world aligns with the time period that modern geology identifies as a global discontinuity. The Hopi's description of the ant people contains details that are difficult to account for through standard mythological interpretation. Standard interpretive frameworks applied to indigenous mythology tend to look for environmental explanations. Ants are ubiquitous in the Sonoran Desert. A myth about ant-like beings who sheltered and fed the ancestors during catastrophe makes ecological sense as metaphor for community cooperation during drought. Except the Hopi descriptions don't stop at the metaphorical level. The ant people are described as having lived underground already when the Hopi ancestors descended to join them. They were not described as having descended with the Hopi. They were already there, already established, already sustaining a civilization in the dark. The Hopi were guests in their domain. The ant people are also described as having knowledge of the previous worlds, the ones that ended in fire and flood. They are described as having been present for those catastrophes, having survived them, having carried the memory of them. This creates a timeline problem for the metaphorical interpretation. If the ant people are encoding actual ants or a localized human community, they cannot have existed through multiple world-ending catastrophes. Ants do not carry multi-generational oral history, and a human community could not survive the kinds of catastrophes the Hopi describe without some extraordinary resource or technology. But if the ant people describe something else entirely, a civilization that had adapted to subterranean life over an extremely long period of time, and had indeed survived multiple surface catastrophes, because the surface was not where they lived, the description becomes internally consistent. The Hopi are not the only indigenous people of the Americas to describe subterranean beings who survived through underground living while the surface was destroyed. The Lakota have similar traditions. The Zuni, neighbors of the Hopi, have parallel cosmologies. The Aztec and Maya, in their creation narratives, describe previous peoples who went into the earth and did not come back. These traditions appear independently in cultures that had no contact with each other during the periods when these traditions would have formed, and they describe the same thing. Something below, something that was there before, something that went down and stayed. In 1935, a geologist named Edwin McKee was conducting a survey of the Red Wall limestone layer in the Grand Canyon's inner gorge when he and his team encountered an anomaly they did not initially know how to explain. At a depth of approximately 14,200 feet below the south rim, in a section of canyon wall not accessible by any established trail, McKee's team identified a section of the limestone face that showed signs of what he described in his field notes as artificial modification. The rock face showed evidence of having been worked, smoothed in a pattern consistent with intentional shaping, rather than natural erosion. Behind the worked section, McKee's team identified an opening approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall. They did not explore it. Their survey mission did not include spelunking, and they lacked the equipment to safely investigate the interior. McKee reported this finding to the U.S. Geological Survey. The response he received, which is documented in the USGS's administrative correspondence files from that year, was notably mild. He was thanked for his report, the location was noted, and no follow-up expedition was dispatched. McKee's 1938 monograph on the Red Wall limestone, which remains a foundational text in Grand Canyon geology, contains no mention of the worked stone face or the opening behind it. Why not? McKee's field notes exist. The location he described exists. The USGS correspondence exists. The omission from his published work exists. What doesn't exist is any explanation for why a geologist of McKee's caliber would document something anomalous and then decline to include it in his definitive study of the very rock layer where he found it. The Smithsonian Institution's relationship with the Grand Canyon has always been an interesting one. The Bureau of American Ethnology funded some of the most extensive documentation of Hopi traditions in the late 19th and early 20th century. The ethnographic record that exists for these cultures would not exist without the Smithsonian's institutional commitment to documenting what it feared was disappearing. At the same time, the Smithsonian has been, in certain specific areas, unusually resistant to inquiry. Researchers who have attempted to access certain categories of material in the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History have reported experiences that range from lengthy administrative delays to outright denials, sometimes without explanation. The categories that seem to generate the most friction tend to cluster around a few subjects: artifacts of uncertain provenance from the American Southwest, skeletal remains of individuals whose anthropological classification is ambiguous, and documentation related to pre-Columbian contact between the Americas and other civilizations. The Grand Canyon intersects all three of these categories. The 1909 Arizona Gazette article, if true, would represent artifacts of uncertain provenance from the American Southwest. The mummified remains the article describes would fall into the skeletal remains category, and the writing system described, if it bore no resemblance to known Native American scripts, would be precisely the kind of evidence that pre-Columbian contact researchers have been looking for and consistently failing to find in institutional archives. The specific pattern of gaps, the 1908 to 1912 Bureau of American Ethnology field records, the absence of any institutional response to McKee's 1935 report, the denial of the 1909 expedition, these do not cluster randomly. They cluster around a specific place, a specific time period, and a specific question. What is beneath the Grand Canyon? We need to talk about the Hopi knowledge system itself, because dismissing what they said in 1894 requires you to dismiss something much larger than a single story. The Hopi have demonstrated repeatedly and verifiably that their oral traditions encode accurate information about events that modern science has only recently confirmed. Their traditions describe a period when the land was covered by water, a claim that seems implausible for a desert people until you examine the geology of the Colorado Plateau and discover that it was indeed covered by a shallow inland sea during the Cretaceous period, a fact the Hopi had no scientific way of knowing. Their traditions describe a period of intense cold, what they call the Second World's destruction, in terms that closely parallel what we now understand as the Younger Dryas period, the abrupt cooling event approximately 12,900 years ago that devastated early human populations across the Northern Hemisphere. Their traditions describe a period of catastrophic flooding, consistent with what we know about the glacial melt and flooding that followed. In each of these cases, the Hopi oral tradition preserved accurate information about past catastrophic events across time periods that dwarf any written record. They didn't do this through writing. They did it through ceremony, through the precise repetition of story, through the maintenance of a tradition that treated accurate historical memory as a sacred obligation. When a tradition like this one tells you something is sleeping beneath the canyon, you have to ask yourself a serious question. What would it take for them to be wrong about this specific thing while being right about everything else? In 2011, a team of researchers from Northern Arizona University conducted a preliminary acoustic survey of the Grand Canyon south wall in the section of canyon known as the Haunted Canyon. Acoustic surveys use sound waves to map underground structures, the same principle as sonar. The 2012 survey was not looking for anything anomalous. It was part of a broader study of the canyon's subsurface hydrology. What the survey returned, in addition to the hydrological data it was designed to collect, was a set of reflections that the team's lead researcher described in an internal memo as structurally inconsistent with the surrounding geology. Specifically, at a depth corresponding to the Redwall limestone layer, the survey detected a series of cavities whose geometry was unusually regular, not the irregular dissolution carved shapes typical of karst cave systems, regular, rectangular, in some cases, consistent in their dimensions. The memo recommended further investigation. Whether that investigation occurred has not been publicly documented. The study's final published findings address only the hydrological data. The structural anomalies are not mentioned. We know about the internal memo because a graduate student who worked on the project discussed it in a presentation at a 2014 academic conference on southwestern geology. The presentation was not recorded. The graduate student, who has since completed her doctorate and works in private sector geological consulting, declined to be interviewed. There is a place on the north rim of the Grand Canyon that the Hopi have always called by a name that translates roughly as the place where the breath comes from the earth. Visitors to this location, who are almost exclusively Hopi or non-Hopi researchers, granted permission to accompany them, describe a persistent phenomenon. In certain weather conditions, particularly during the transition between winter and spring, the rock face in this area exhales. There is a sustained, audible exhalation of air from cracks in the stone. Not the intermittent draft you'd expect from a shallow cave, a continuous, steady outflow of air, warmer than the ambient temperature outside, that continues for extended periods. Geologists explain it as a pressure equalization effect. The vast connected cave systems beneath the plateau breathe as barometric pressure changes, exhaling when pressure drops. The observation is real. The explanation is reasonable. But the temperature differential complicates it. Air emerging from a cave system that is simply pressure equalizing should be approximately the temperature of the cave interior, roughly the mean annual surface temperature of the region, about 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The air from the place the Hopi call by this name is reportedly warmer, significantly warmer. Warmer air from underground typically has one of two explanations: geothermal activity or metabolic activity, the heat produced by living organisms. The Grand Canyon region has low geothermal activity. The Colorado Plateau is not a volcanically active area. The heat gradient from Earth's interior at this depth would not account for the temperature differential that has been described, which leaves the second explanation. The Hopi prophecy tradition describes a sequence of world-ending events they call the Great Purification, the transition from the fourth world to whatever comes after. Within this sequence, one of the more literal-sounding signs is described in terms that translate approximately as the awakening of what sleeps. The Hopi say that as the fourth world approaches its end, the beings who went into the earth will come back to the surface. Not all of them, not immediately, but the process of their return will be one of the signs that the cycle is completing. They describe this not as an invasion, not as a catastrophe in itself, as a return. Something that went away is coming back, something that was here before the Hopi, something that the Hopi have been maintaining a relationship with through ceremony, through the kiva, through the act of descent and return that every Kachina ceremony enacts, something that the Hopi have been keeping a place for. The kiva is not a worship space in the way a church or mosque is a worship space. It is a meeting place between worlds, built underground, entered through the roof by ladder, through a hole in the ceiling that replicates the original sipapu. Every time a Hopi enters a kiva for ceremony, they are reenacting the descent. They are maintaining the relationship. They are keeping the connection active. With what? The Hopi will answer that question. The answer is the ancestors. But not the ancestors as we usually mean the word, not dead grandparents whose memory we honor. The ancestors as a living category of being, presently existing in a different relationship with the world than the one we inhabit on the surface, but not gone, not dead, not purely spiritual in the sense of being without material form. Still there, still in contact, still breathing. There is one more piece of this story that belongs here. It involves a man named Alexander Stephen, by most accounts the most thorough documentarian of Hopi life in the late 19th century. Stephen was a Scottish-born trader who settled among the Hopi in 1880 and spent the next 14 years recording his observations in a journal of extraordinary detail. He attended ceremonies that no outside researcher before or since has been permitted to attend. He learned the Hopi language at a native level of fluency. He documented things that Fuchs and the other professional ethnologists, arriving later as institutional outsiders, never got access to. Stephen died in 1894, the same year the Hopi were making their most explicit statements about what lay beneath the canyon. His journals were not published until 1936, 42 years after his death. The published version, edited by Elsie Clues-Parsons, is considered a foundational document of Hopi studies. The published journals are approximately half the length of the original manuscript, which is held in the Museum of Northern Arizona in Flagstaff. Researchers who have compared the published version with the original manuscript have noted the categories of material Parsons chose not to include. Some of it is ceremonial detail considered too sensitive to publish. Some of it, however, involves Stephen's account of conversations with a specific elder who told Stephen things that Stephen recorded and Parsons chose not to publish. What those things were is not fully known, because access to the unpublished portions of the Stephen manuscript is restricted by an agreement between the Museum of Northern Arizona and the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office. The Hopi have the right to control access to their own sacred knowledge. That right is not in question. What it means, however, is that the most complete record of what an intimate observer of Hopi life documented about the subterranean world in the 1880s and early 1890s, the period immediately preceding the formal documentation that began with Fuchs in 1894, is currently not available to outside researchers. The Hopi know what Stephen wrote about. They have read it. They made a decision about it. That decision is their right, but it tells you something that they made it. What do we do with all of this? The skeptical position is clear. The Hopi have a rich tradition that encodes cultural memory in narrative form. The 1909 Arizona Gazette article is a fabrication or misrepresentation. The Smithsonian's archive gaps are administrative artifacts. McKee's unpublished finding is an ambiguity he chose not to pursue. The acoustic survey anomalies are natural formations. The warm air is a minor geothermal anomaly. The Stephen manuscript restrictions are about cultural sensitivity, not concealment of information about non-human civilization. This position is coherent. It holds together. It is what the professional academic world believes, to the extent that it believes anything about this at all. The alternative position is also clear. The Hopi are the oldest continuously inhabited civilization in North America. Their oral tradition has been verified as accurate in multiple specific scientific claims. They have been saying consistently, for as long as anyone has been writing it down, that there is something alive beneath the Grand Canyon. Multiple independent lines of institutional documentation, all suppressed or obscured by the same institution, point toward the same conclusion the Hopi reached. The cavities beneath the canyon are real, are unusually regular in geometry, and have never been fully investigated by anyone whose findings were made public. And the Hopi have been maintaining a ritual practice specifically designed to preserve the connection with whatever is down there, a practice maintained continuously for at least 1,000 years. The question of which position is correct may not be answerable from the surface. It is answerable from below. In Hopi ceremony there is a figure called Masawu. He is the guardian of the fourth world, the being who met the Hopi ancestors when they emerged from the underworld and gave them permission to live on the surface of this world. He is associated with death, with the boundary between worlds, with the land in its most elemental form. His face, in Hopi iconography, is a skull, or a mask of a skull. The distinction between the two is considered irrelevant by the Hopi. Masawu told the Hopi ancestors, when they came up through the Sipapu, that they could live here. He also told them this was not their permanent home. The fourth world would end as the previous worlds had ended. When it did, they would go back down, and the beings below would come back up, and the cycle would continue. The Hopi relationship with the world is fundamentally cyclical in a way that the linear, progress-oriented worldview of Western civilization finds very difficult to accommodate. We think in terms of past and future as two different states, the past being gone and the future being new. The Hopi think in terms of a cycle. Nothing that was ever here is entirely gone, it's just in a different phase. The ant people are in a dormant phase, the fourth world is in an active phase. When the active phase ends, the dormant phase will become active again. This is not a prediction of apocalypse, it is a description of a rotation. Whether that rotation is a myth encoding psychological truth about the transience of civilization, or a literal description of a physical reality presently taking place beneath approximately 2,000 feet of Arizona limestone, depends on what you believe is possible. The Hopi, who have been right about the water, right about the ice, right about the flood, and right about the geology for as long as anyone has been checking, believe it is literal. And in 1894 they were trying very hard to tell someone. It took 130 years to find someone willing to listen. The Grand Canyon receives approximately 6 million visitors per year. They stand at the rim, they take photographs, they walk down the Bright Angel Trail. They look at the layers of rock and marvel at geological time. They feel small. Almost none of them know what the Hopi say is at the bottom. Almost none of them know about the 1909 expedition, or McKee's 1935 field notes, or Fuchs's 1894 anomalous observation, or the acoustic survey, or the warm air that breathes out of the canyon walls at the place where the breath comes from the earth. The canyon sits there. It has been sitting there for 5 million years, which is how long the Colorado River has been cutting through the Kaibab Plateau. But the rock it's cutting through is 2 billion years old, and the formations beneath the Redwall limestone are older still. And what the Hopi say has been living in those formations has been there longer than the canyon itself, longer than the river, longer than the limestone it carved. What was there before the Grand Canyon was a canyon?